Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. What you're about to hear is a real-life mystery hidden beneath an ordinary home, and the truth behind it explains why the previous owners disappeared so suddenly. If you enjoy stories where something feels wrong from the very first moment, you're in the right place. Mary Collins had chosen the house for its stillness. It stood at the edge of a modest Midwestern town where nothing much ever seemed to happen, a place of trimmed lawns, early sunsets, and neighbors who waved without asking questions. After decades spent moving from one work site to another, following projects and deadlines across several states, Mary had wanted something solid and uneventful. The house offered exactly that, or so it had seemed. Built in the early 20th century, it carried the reassuring weight of age without appearing neglected. Thick walls, a broad porch, a basement that smelled faintly of old concrete and earth. It felt permanent, and permanence mattered to her. Mary lived alone. Her days followed a predictable rhythm shaped by habit rather than necessity. She woke early, made her coffee strong, and read local news at the kitchen table while the town slowly came to life outside her windows. Retirement had not dulled her alertness. If anything, it had sharpened it, stripping away distractions and leaving her with time to notice small details. She knew the house well, knew how the floors creaked at night when the temperature dropped, how the plumbing sighed before the radiators warmed. She trusted those familiar sounds. They told her that everything was as it should be. That trust wavered late one night when she was woken by something she could not immediately name. It was not a sharp noise, but a deep, muffled sensation, as though the house itself had exhaled. Mary lay still in the darkness, listening. The sound did not repeat, but the silence that followed felt different, heavier. She dismissed it as the kind of thing old houses did, yet sleep came slowly after that. When morning arrived, she moved through the house with a vague unease she could not explain. It was in the basement that she saw it. Mary had gone down to retrieve a box of winter clothes, switching on the bare bulb that cast a dull yellow light across the concrete floor. At first, she noticed nothing unusual. Then her eye caught a thin, dark line near the far wall, one that had not been there before. She stepped closer, setting the box aside, and felt a tightening in her chest. The line was not superficial. It ran across the floor and climbed partway up the wall, splitting the concrete with unsettling precision. She crouched to examine it, tracing the edges with her eyes but not touching. The crack was fresh. That much was obvious to her, even without tools. The concrete around it was clean, unweathered, as though something had forced its way through from below. Mary straightened slowly, her thoughts already shifting from surprise to calculation. Houses did not do this overnight without a reason. She spent the rest of the morning inspecting the basement. There were no signs of moisture, no obvious leaks or drainage problems. The walls were dry. The foundation, apart from the crack, appeared unchanged. Yet the sense that something fundamental had shifted refused to leave her. She tried to recall whether there had been any warning signs during the purchase of the house. The inspection report had been thorough, or at least it had seemed so at the time. Minor cosmetic issues, nothing structural. She had trusted the paperwork, trusted the neatness of the repairs she had seen. Now, standing alone beneath her own home, Mary felt the weight of that trust pressing back against her. She knew better than most how easily surface-level fixes could hide deeper problems. Years earlier, before retirement, she had worked as a structural engineer, often called in when something had already gone wrong. She had seen buildings fail not because of dramatic disasters, but because of slow, ignored weaknesses. She had learned to respect cracks, especially new ones. Throughout the day, she moved through her routines with mechanical care, but her attention kept drifting back to the basement. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the distant passing of a truck outside all made her pause. By evening, the air inside the house felt different to her, though she could not have explained why. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had grown uncertain, even while appearing unchanged. That night, the sounds returned. This time, Mary was not asleep when she felt them. She was sitting in her living room reading when a faint vibration passed through the floor. It was subtle enough that someone less attentive might have ignored it. The glass of water on the coffee table trembled almost imperceptibly. Mary closed her book and waited. Another vibration followed, deeper than the first, accompanied by a dull creak that seemed to come from below. Her heart began to beat faster, not from panic but from recognition. She had felt this kind of thing before, long ago, standing on construction sites and listening to structures speak in their own language. She rose and crossed the room, placing her palm flat against the wall. The vibration was there, faint but undeniable. Sleep did not come easily. Mary lay awake, cataloging possibilities. Soil settlement, an underground water issue, old utility lines failing. Each explanation felt insufficient. The crack had not followed a random path. It had formed with intent, as though responding to a force acting from beneath the foundation rather than from within the walls themselves. At first light, she returned to the basement. The crack had widened slightly, just enough to confirm her fears. She fetched a flashlight and knelt again, shining the beam along its length. The edges were sharper now, the gap deeper. She felt a familiar shift within herself, the transition from homeowner to professional observer. This was no longer about comfort or inconvenience. This was about safety. Mary went out to the garage and began sorting through boxes she had not opened in years. Retirement had not persuaded her to discard everything from her working life. Measuring tools, notebooks, old equipment lay stored away like artifacts from another identity. She pulled them out carefully, setting them on the workbench. As she did, fragments of memory surfaced, not sentimental but practical. Case studies, failures she had analyzed, warning signs she had once taught younger engineers to recognize. She returned to the basement with a small notebook in hand and began making notes. The crack's orientation, its length, the slight unevenness in the floor nearby. She pressed her ear close to the ground and held still. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then she heard it, a faint sound that did not belong to the house itself. It was a muted snapping noise, distant and irregular, as if something deep underground were giving way. Mary straightened slowly, her face pale but composed. She did not allow herself to jump to conclusions, but one thought refused to leave her. This did not feel like ordinary settling. It felt like a warning. The house, which had seemed so quiet and reliable, was telling her something she could not afford to ignore. She climbed the stairs back into the kitchen and stood there, looking around at the familiar space. The sunlight through the window painted everything in warm, reassuring tones. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. Yet beneath it all, something had changed. Mary knew that whatever lay ahead, it had begun with that single crack, forming silently in the night, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Mary Collins did not allow herself the comfort of denial. Once the initial shock of discovery had passed, her mind settled into a familiar pattern, one shaped by years of responsibility and consequence. The house had spoken, and she had heard it. Now came the work of understanding what it was trying to say. She knew from experience that structures rarely failed without leaving a trail of evidence, subtle signs that only seemed obvious in hindsight. Her task was to read those signs before they turned into something irreversible. As she moved through the house that morning, memories surfaced unbidden. She remembered standing on unfinished foundations under wide-open skies, reviewing blueprints smudged with dust and fingerprints. She remembered being called to sites where corners had been cut, where shortcuts had been taken in the hope that time would never reveal them. In those places, the ground itself often told the story long before walls cracked or beams sagged. Soil shifted, supports weakened, pressure found the smallest point of resistance. What she was seeing in her basement followed that same logic. She dressed carefully, choosing sturdy shoes and practical clothes, then returned to the basement with renewed purpose. The crack no longer felt like an anomaly, but like a starting point. She measured its length again, noting the slight increase since the previous evening. She ran her hand close to it without touching, feeling the cool air rising from below. That detail troubled her more than the widening itself. Air movement suggested space, and space beneath a foundation was never a benign thing. Mary moved methodically, examining the basement walls one by one. She looked for hairline fractures, discoloration, any sign of stress that might radiate outward from the main crack. There were a few patched areas, subtle and neatly done, easy to overlook unless one knew exactly what to look for. She crouched to examine them more closely. The repairs were not recent, but they were deliberate. Someone had taken care to smooth over imperfections rather than address their cause. She straightened and took a slow breath. The house had been owned before. That was obvious enough. What was less obvious was how much its past had been concealed. Mary made notes in her notebook, recording the location of each patch, the texture of the surrounding concrete. She was no longer simply a homeowner assessing damage. She was conducting an investigation. From a shelf near the stairs, she retrieved a compact device she had once used to detect ground movement on small-scale projects. It was old but reliable, designed to register vibrations that human senses might miss. She hesitated for a moment, weighing the seriousness of what she was doing. This was not a casual check. Once she began collecting data, she would not be able to dismiss the results as imagination or coincidence. She placed the device on the basement floor near the crack and activated it. At first, the readings were steady, almost reassuring. She waited, watching the display, listening to the quiet hum of the house around her. Then gradually, the numbers shifted. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. There was movement below, irregular and intermittent, not the consistent pattern of nearby traffic or household systems. Mary adjusted the settings, narrowing the range. The readings spiked briefly, then settled, then spiked again. She frowned, her attention fully absorbed. These were not surface vibrations. They originated deeper, resonating upward through layers of earth and concrete. She felt a tightening in her chest, not fear exactly, but the weight of confirmation. Her instincts had been right. She spent the next several hours moving the sensor to different points in the basement, mapping the pattern as best she could. The strongest readings clustered near the far wall where the crack had first appeared. The vibrations were not constant. They came in bursts, as though something below was shifting in stages, pausing, then continuing. Mary recognized that pattern too. It suggested failure under load, material giving way piece by piece rather than all at once. By early afternoon, fatigue began to creep in, but she ignored it. She sat on the basement steps, reviewing her notes, comparing the data with scenarios she had encountered in her career. Sinkholes, subsurface erosion, abandoned infrastructure. Each possibility carried its own implications, but one stood out more than the others. The town she lived in had once been part of a region shaped by industry long since faded. She remembered reading about it when she first moved in, though she had paid little attention at the time. Old factories, rail lines, mines. The thought lingered, uncomfortable but persistent. Mary rose and went upstairs, retrieving a folder from her desk. Inside were documents from the home purchase, including a brief historical summary of the property. It was sparse, offering little beyond construction dates and zoning information. There was no mention of anything beneath the surface. She felt a flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed. Omission was not proof, but it was often a clue. As evening approached, the house grew quieter. The vibrations continued, faint but present, like a distant heartbeat. Mary prepared a simple meal but barely tasted it. Her thoughts kept returning to the same question. How much time did she have? She knew better than to assume immediate disaster, but she also knew that certain processes, once started, could accelerate without warning. She returned to the basement one last time that night. The crack had widened again, not dramatically, but enough to be measurable. She knelt and shone her flashlight into it, angling the beam as deeply as she could. The light vanished quickly, swallowed by darkness. She switched the sensor back on and watched as another brief spike registered on the display. Somewhere below, something had shifted. Mary stood slowly, her knees protesting, and leaned against the wall for support. She felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind that came when uncertainty gave way to understanding. Whatever lay beneath her home was not stable, and it was not done moving. This was beyond the scope of what she could safely assess alone. She went upstairs and picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Her nephew worked in technical inspection, a practical, level-headed man who understood the seriousness of structural risk. She hesitated only a moment before sending a message asking him to come by as soon as possible. She did not embellish or dramatize. She simply said there was something beneath the house that needed to be seen. Afterwards, she sat in the living room as night fell, listening to the familiar sounds of the house layered over something older and more troubling. The quiet home she had chosen for its peace now felt like a threshold, a place balanced between what was visible and what had been hidden for decades. Mary knew that the next step would bring answers, but answers had a way of changing everything. The night passed without sleep. Mary remained on the couch, a blanket folded over her legs, the lights dimmed but not fully off. She listened to the house as she had learned to listen long ago, not passively but with intent. Every sound was weighed, placed into context, measured against memory. The vibrations continued, irregular and subdued, never loud enough to announce themselves yet persistent enough to refuse dismissal. By morning, fatigue settled into her bones, but her mind remained sharp, honed by the quiet urgency of the situation. Her nephew arrived shortly after sunrise. He was methodical by nature, accustomed to environments where caution mattered more than speed. Mary did not greet him with dramatics. She led him directly to the basement, allowing the space to speak for itself. The crack was wider now, still measured in fractions, but undeniably changed from the day before. The patched sections of wall stood out more clearly under fresh eyes, their neatness almost suspicious in contrast to the raw fracture nearby. They moved carefully, examining the floor, the walls, the air itself. Mary explained what she had recorded, her observations delivered with the calm precision of someone used to testifying to facts rather than feelings. She described the vibrations, the pattern, the sense of void beneath the concrete. He listened closely, asking few questions, his attention focused on the same details she had noticed. He confirmed what she already suspected. This was not something to be handled with surface repairs or guesswork. Together, they prepared the equipment. The inspection camera was compact, designed for pipes and narrow shafts, with a flexible line capable of descending far beyond the reach of light. The device felt heavier in Mary's hands than it should have, not from its physical weight, but from the implication of what it might reveal. They selected a spot near the deepest part of the crack, where the air seemed to flow upward more freely, and began drilling slowly, carefully into the concrete. The sound of the drill echoed through the basement, harsh and intrusive. Dust collected on the floor as the bit cut through the slab. Mary felt a flicker of unease but pushed it aside. This was necessary. When the drill finally broke through, the change was immediate. The resistance vanished and the sound shifted, hollow and resonant, as though the house itself had exhaled again. They stopped and listened. There was no collapse, no sudden movement, but the silence felt altered. Mary steadied herself and helped guide the camera line into the opening. At first, the monitor showed only darkness, the beam of the camera's light illuminating nothing but empty air. The line descended smoothly, unspooling with deceptive ease. The depth markers ticked past what should have been the soil layer beneath the foundation. Then the camera dropped. The line jerked sharply in Mary's hands, pulled downward by its own weight as resistance disappeared entirely. The image on the screen shifted wildly before stabilizing, revealing nothing but vast darkness beyond the reach of the light. There were no walls close enough to reflect the beam, no immediate ground beneath, just space. Mary felt her breath catch, a rare moment where instinct overrode discipline. They stopped the descent and held the line steady. The depth reading continued to climb far beyond what either of them expected. This was not a small cavity or a washed-out pocket of soil. This was something immense. Mary's mind raced through possibilities, discarding them as quickly as they formed. The scale alone ruled out most benign explanations. As they began to retrieve the camera, the vibrations intensified. This time they were unmistakable. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and a low grinding sound rose from below, accompanied by a sharp cracking noise that echoed through the basement walls. Mary felt the shift before she saw it, a subtle lurch in the structure as though the house had lost its balance. The wall nearest the crack began to crumble. Small fragments of concrete broke free, falling inward toward the opening. Mary stepped back instinctively, pulling the camera line with her. The vibrations surged, then peaked, and suddenly the wall gave way. It did not collapse outward as one might expect. It fell inward, vanishing as if swallowed. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. Mary shielded her face, retreating up the steps as debris continued to slide into the void. The sound was overwhelming, a roar of falling material that seemed to go on far longer than gravity alone should allow. When it finally subsided, an unnatural quiet followed, deeper and more complete than before. As the dust slowly settled, Mary descended the steps again, her movements cautious, her heart pounding. Where the wall had been was now an opening, jagged and uneven, leading into a darkness that felt vast and absolute. The beam of her flashlight reached nothing solid. It vanished into the same emptiness the camera had found. She understood then what she was looking at. This was no natural formation. The straight edges buried beneath broken concrete, the depth, the scale, all pointed to something man-made and long abandoned. A shaft, a mine. The realization brought with it a wave of cold clarity. The house had not simply cracked. It had been standing on borrowed time. Mary stepped back, every instinct warning her away from the edge. The ground beneath her feet felt suddenly fragile, unreliable. She imagined the countless years during which the space below had remained hidden, supported by materials never meant to last this long. Whatever had finally failed had done so quietly, almost patiently. They left the basement without another word and sealed the door behind them. Upstairs, the house felt different now, its solidity and illusion stripped away. Mary sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she had not realized she'd poured. The danger was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a depth, a presence that could not be ignored. She knew that what they had uncovered would require experts, official intervention, and consequences that would reach far beyond her quiet life. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was another feeling, one she recognized well. Resolve. The truth had been exposed, and no matter what followed, it was better than the silence that had nearly claimed her home and her life without warning. What had revealed itself in the basement did not remain contained there. Once the wall had fallen inward and the void had been exposed, the house seemed to enter a new phase of instability, as though the balance it had maintained for decades had finally been broken. Mary spent the first hours after the discovery in a state of heightened awareness, moving slowly through each room, listening, feeling the subtle responses of the structure beneath her feet. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like something standing on the edge of a decision it could no longer postpone. The vibrations intensified as the day went on. They were no longer faint or ambiguous. At irregular intervals, the floor would tremble just enough to be felt through the soles of her shoes. A reminder that the ground beneath was still shifting, still surrendering to forces long ignored. Each tremor carried with it a dull sound, not quite an echo, not quite a crack, but something between the two. Mary knew that sound. It was the voice of material failing under its own weight. She returned to the basement only once, standing at the top of the stairs rather than descending. The opening where the wall had been was now larger, its edges unstable, shedding small fragments that vanished soundlessly into the darkness below. The air rising from the shaft was cool and stale, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of earth untouched by daylight. She did not need to see more. The message was clear. Staying any longer was a risk she could not justify. As the afternoon wore on, the structure responded to the loss beneath it. A door upstairs jammed when she tried to close it. A thin line appeared along the ceiling near the living room wall, barely visible but unmistakable to her trained eye. The house was redistributing stress, searching for new points of support where none truly existed. Mary felt a growing urgency, not panic, but a sharpened focus that left no room for hesitation. Another tremor came, stronger than the rest. This time, it was accompanied by a sharp, splintering sound that rose from below and traveled upward through the walls. The floor beneath Mary shifted noticeably, enough to throw her slightly off balance. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself, her heart racing. This was no longer a slow process. Something significant had just given way. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A deep, prolonged rumble, like distant thunder trapped underground. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill the house itself. From the basement came the sound of concrete breaking free, of debris sliding and falling into the void. Mary moved instinctively toward the front door, each step measured, deliberate, as though sudden movements might provoke the structure further. As she reached the hallway, the house shuddered again. This time, the movement was violent. The walls groaned, the ceiling creaked, and somewhere behind her, something heavy collapsed with a force that shook the entire frame of the building. Dust filtered down from above, coating the floor in a fine gray layer. Mary did not stop. She pulled the door open and stepped outside just as another section of the basement wall gave way. From the safety of the yard, she watched as the house settled unevenly, one corner dipping lower than the rest. The sound of the collapse was muffled now, contained within the structure, but its effects were visible. The ground near the foundation cracked, the soil pulling away as though retreating from the house itself. Mary stood still, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on the place where she had lived in quiet certainty only days before. When the movement finally ceased, the silence that followed was profound. The house stood, but only barely, its stability compromised beyond any reasonable doubt. Mary felt the full weight of what had almost happened. Had the collapse occurred hours earlier, while she slept or while she stood in the basement, the outcome would have been catastrophic. The void beneath the house was not simply a hazard. It was a death trap, patient and unforgiving. She sank onto the steps of the porch, her legs weak beneath her. For the first time since the crack had appeared, she allowed herself to feel the fear she had kept at bay. It came not as panic, but as a deep, sobering awareness of vulnerability. The knowledge that the ground could simply disappear, that solid walls could give way without warning, left her shaken in a way no professional experience ever had. Yet even as the fear settled, another realization took hold. This collapse had not been random. It had not been an act of nature alone. It was the result of something buried, forgotten, and deliberately ignored. The house had been built atop a weakness that no one had bothered to confront, a legacy of the past concealed beneath layers of concrete and paperwork. Emergency crews arrived later, responding to reports of structural failure. They cordoned off the area, inspected the damage, and confirmed what Mary already knew. The house was unsafe. No one would be allowed back inside. As she answered their questions, she felt a strange detachment, as though she were describing someone else's home, someone else's narrow escape. That evening, as she sat in a borrowed chair in a neighbor's yard, wrapped in a blanket offered without words, Mary looked at the house one last time before darkness fell. The collapse had exposed more than a physical void. It had revealed a truth hidden for generations, a reminder that the past, when ignored, does not remain buried forever. The danger she had sensed from the first crack had been real, immediate, and nearly fatal. And now that it had surfaced, there would be no turning back, only the slow uncovering of everything that lay beneath. The days that followed blurred into one another, measured not by hours but by procedures, reports, and the steady arrival of unfamiliar vehicles. Where Mary's quiet street had once known only routine traffic, it now hosted utility trucks, survey vans, and official cars marked with county insignia. The collapse had drawn attention beyond the neighborhood, awakening institutions that dealt not with comfort or aesthetics, but with risk, liability, and the long memory of the land itself. Mary was temporarily relocated to a small furnished apartment arranged through local authorities. It was clean and functional, but it felt weightless to her, lacking the gravity of a place shaped by years of personal history. Each morning, she returned to the edge of the cordoned property to observe from a distance as specialists worked. She was no longer the primary investigator, yet she could not detach herself from the process. What lay beneath her former home had nearly claimed her life, and she needed to understand it fully. Geologists were the first to arrive in earnest. They approached the site with the quiet seriousness of people accustomed to dealing with forces far older than human error. Using ground-penetrating radar and seismic mapping tools, they surveyed the earth beneath the structure and the surrounding lots. Mary watched their screens light up with layered images of subsurface voids, lines and shadows forming a map of absence rather than presence. The data confirmed what her instincts had already told her. The void beneath the house was not an isolated pocket. It was part of a larger network. As the analysis continued, the picture grew clearer. The house stood directly above a vertical shaft connected to a horizontal tunnel system that extended well beyond the property line. The scale was sobering. This was not a minor excavation or a forgotten cellar. It was the remnant of an industrial operation, buried not by design, but by neglect. Records were pulled from county archives, some digitized, others retrieved from storage rooms, where paper smelled faintly of dust and age. Mary was invited to sit in on one of the briefings. She listened as specialists explained the history of the region, tracing it back to the early 20th century when coal mining had fueled local growth. The mine beneath her house had operated briefly before being abandoned when yields declined and larger operations moved elsewhere. At the time, closure procedures were informal by modern standards. Wooden supports were left in place, shafts capped with materials never intended to last more than a few decades. Time, moisture, and pressure had done the rest. The timbers had slowly rotted away, weakened by groundwater and shifting soil. What remained was a fragile balance maintained by nothing more than compacted earth and chance. The crown hole that had formed beneath Mary's basement was the final stage of a process that had begun long before she was born. Engineers explained how the collapse had propagated upward. As the shaft cap failed, material from above fell into the void, creating a funnel effect. The ground had sunk incrementally, each small movement barely noticeable on the surface until the structural integrity of the foundation was compromised. The crack Mary had discovered was not the beginning. It was the last warning. What unsettled her most was not the existence of the mine itself, but how thoroughly its presence had been erased from practical consideration. Zoning maps had been redrawn. Property records had omitted subsurface risks. Somewhere along the way, responsibility had dissolved into bureaucracy, leaving homeowners to inherit danger without knowledge or consent. That sense of unease deepened when investigators turned their attention to the house's more recent past. Structural engineers examined the foundation closely, documenting the patch cracks Mary had noticed earlier. What initially appeared to be routine maintenance took on a different meaning under professional scrutiny. The repairs had been cosmetic, carefully executed to conceal rather than correct. Materials were chosen for appearance, not strength. Hairline fractures had been filled and smoothed, their warning erased. The timeline became damning. The patches corresponded with the period shortly before the house had been listed for sale. Records showed that the previous owners had commissioned minor repairs, but had not disclosed any structural concerns. No mention of subsurface instability appeared in the seller's disclosures. To anyone without specialized knowledge, the house would have seemed sound, even well cared for. Mary felt a familiar tightening in her chest as the implications settled in. This was not ignorance. This was avoidance. Someone had known enough to recognize the signs and had chosen to hide them. The idea that she had trusted that silence, that she had lived above a collapsing shaft because of someone else's calculated decision, filled her with a cold, restrained anger. Investigators uncovered more. Invoices from contractors suggested hurried work, completed quickly and cheaply. There were notes referencing recurring cracks, vague concerns dismissed as normal settling. One document, buried among others, mentioned an old mine map consulted and disregarded. It was enough to establish intent. As the case took shape, Mary found herself oscillating between professional detachment and personal reckoning. Part of her analyzed the findings as she always had, evaluating cause and effect, tracing failure to its origin. Another part of her replayed quieter moments in the house, the nights she had slept peacefully above an emptiness that could have swallowed her without warning. She walked the perimeter of the site one afternoon as crews prepared to seal the exposed shaft. Heavy equipment stood ready to pour concrete and stabilize the ground, an expensive but necessary intervention. Mary watched as the darkness beneath her former home was slowly filled, not erased but restrained. The mine would never be restored to safety, but it would no longer be allowed to threaten lives. The house itself was deemed beyond saving. Engineers explained that even with the shaft stabilized, the structural damage was too severe. The foundation had been compromised in ways that could not be reliably repaired. Demolition was inevitable. Mary accepted this with a quiet nod. The house had been a vessel, not an identity. Its loss, while painful, felt secondary to the knowledge of what it had concealed. Legal proceedings began soon after. The previous owners were contacted, questioned, and eventually charged with fraud. Their decision to sell quickly, to conceal known risks, was laid bare by documentation and expert testimony. Mary followed the developments at a distance, Justice, she knew, would move slowly, measured by statutes and schedules rather than moral urgency. What remained with her most strongly was the lesson carved into her experience. The ground beneath every structure carried a history, whether acknowledged or not. Ignoring that history did not erase it, it merely postponed its reckoning. As she stood watching the final stages of stabilization, Mary felt a profound respect for the forces that had nearly undone her life, and a renewed conviction in the value of paying attention. The danger had been real, and it had been hidden in plain sight. Only by listening, by trusting her instincts and her experience, had she uncovered the truth before it was too late. The past, she realized, was not something that stayed buried. It waited, patient and silent, until someone was willing to look beneath the surface. The final judgment on the house came quietly, delivered not with drama, but with paperwork. Mary received the notice in a plain envelope, its language precise and unemotional. The structure was officially declared uninhabitable, condemned not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent one. The order outlined the reasons in careful detail, citing structural instability, irreversible foundation damage, and unacceptable risk to human life. Mary read the document slowly, absorbing each sentence as if it described something distant rather than the place she had once called home. Evacuation, in her case, had already occurred. Still, the formality of the declaration carried weight. It marked the end of any lingering illusion that the house might somehow be restored or reclaimed. What had happened beneath it had changed everything. The land itself had proven untrustworthy, its hidden past too destructive to ignore. Mary signed where required and returned the papers without hesitation. Some part of her felt relief in the finality of it. The demolition followed weeks later. Mary chose not to watch from close by. She stood at the far edge of the cordoned area, where the details blurred into movement and sound rather than sharp images. Heavy machinery tore into the walls and roof with indifferent efficiency. The house that had once seemed solid and reassuring yielded quickly, its age and damage offering little resistance. Dust rose into the air and drifted away on the wind, carrying with it the last physical traces of her life there. What remained afterward was a leveled site and a scarred patch of ground reinforced with concrete and warning markers. The shaft below had been sealed, stabilized to prevent further collapse, though no one pretended it had been erased. The mine would always be there, dormant and restrained but never truly gone. The land would remember, even if the surface appeared calm again. Legal proceedings unfolded in parallel, slower but no less consequential. Mary was asked to provide statements, to share her observations and records. She did so with the same measured clarity she had brought to every professional responsibility in her life. The evidence against the previous owners was substantial. Investigators demonstrated that they had been aware of recurring structural issues and had taken deliberate steps to conceal them. The patch cracks, the rushed repairs, the omission of known risks from disclosures all formed a pattern that could not be explained away as oversight. The case moved through hearings and filings, its progress marked by dates on a calendar, rather than moments of confrontation. Mary attended some sessions, not out of a desire for retribution, but from a sense of closure. She listened as experts explained the consequences of ignoring subsurface hazards, as legal arguments translated physical danger into financial and ethical terms. When the verdict was delivered, it felt less like a victory than a necessary acknowledgement of responsibility. Compensation followed, structured and limited, incapable of restoring what had been lost, but sufficient to ensure Mary's future security. She accepted it without celebration. Money could not replace the sense of trust she had once felt in her surroundings, but it could offer stability, and stability mattered. She used part of it to settle into a new home, smaller and newer, built on land thoroughly surveyed and documented. This time, she read every report with a critical eye, asked questions others might not have considered, and listened carefully to the answers. As she adjusted to her new routine, Mary found herself reflecting often on how narrowly she had escaped disaster. The image of the dark shaft beneath her former basement returned to her in quiet moments, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder. Had she ignored the crack, dismissed it as an inconvenience, she would not have had time to react. The collapse would have come without warning, and the outcome would have been final. She thought, too, about the nature of warning signs, how easily they could be overlooked or minimized. In her career, she had taught others to respect small failures, to see them as messages rather than nuisances. Now she understood that lesson on a personal level. The crack had been the ground's way of speaking, and her survival had depended on her willingness to listen. Neighbors stopped her from time to ask questions, to share their own concerns about old houses and unseen risks. Mary answered them patiently, careful not to alarm, but equally careful not to reassure falsely. She emphasized attention, curiosity, and the value of seeking expertise before assumptions hardened into complacency. Her experience had given her a story, but more importantly, it had given her a responsibility to speak honestly about what she had learned. Life settled into a new normal. The days regained their rhythm, though they were quieter now in a different way. Mary took walks, read, and allowed herself the simple pleasure of mornings without tension. Yet beneath that calm ran a deeper awareness, one that did not fade with time. The ground beneath any place she knew carried layers of history and consequence. Ignoring them did not make them harmless. On the anniversary of the collapse, Mary drove past the old neighborhood. The site where her house had stood was fenced off. A sign warning against trespass posted prominently. Grass had begun to grow around the edges, softening the harshness of the intervention, but the markers remained. She parked for a moment and looked at the land, feeling neither sorrow nor anger, only a quiet respect for the truth it had forced into the open. She turned the car around and drove home, her thoughts clear and steady. What had happened had not defined her, but it had sharpened her understanding of the world she lived in. Safety, she realized, was not something granted by appearances or assurances. It was something earned through attention, knowledge, and the courage to act when something felt wrong. The story of the house would eventually fade into records and memories, a case study cited in reports and conversations. For Mary, it remained a personal testament. The past, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of asserting itself. And when it did, the difference between tragedy and survival lay in the willingness to see, to question, and to respond before silence became irreversible. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More true stories, hidden dangers, and real-life mysteries are already waiting for you. Check out our other videos for more stories like this, and share this video with someone who loves suspenseful, real-world narratives. Your support helps the channel grow, and the next story might be even closer than you think.